Hi, everybody. I'm Frank Yang from ADL Ventures. We're going to be having a session today to talk about FOA budgeting. We'll actually talk not only about how to fulfill your budgeting requirements for this FOA, but how to approach the budgeting and planning process for this proposal to achieve long-term success for your company. ADL Ventures is a venture development company, and we've helped launch several companies that have actually funded greater than 80% of their operational expense with non-dilutive funding. That's of course significant because at this stage, every $1 million of grant funding could be worth 20% of your company ownership, or in some cases, much more than that, depending on the type of company and the funding environment. However, it's important to remember that no FOA funding on its own can sufficiently build a company with real products and services that generate revenue. Regardless of your outcome here, the ultimate goal has to be commercial success and robust engagement with your industry ecosystem. For more administrative details on budget preparation, please also refer to this budget module that was done previously by our other Power Connector Entrepreneur Futures Network. Our focus today will be on where the FOA budget fits within your overall company roadmap and aligning all the key spending factors to be productive for your business. I think the first thing to note is that the funding opportunity announcement or FOA process is extremely daunting because there's usually a 9-month lag time or more from full application submission to receiving cash. Here on this slide, you'll see the application deadline for the PV dual use and the thin film FOAs that ADL is currently supporting. Those of you that are watching this module for other FOAs are probably encountering similar timelines. Many FOAs, it's important to note, have at least one round of formal Q&A after submission, which means that multiple rounds of reviews by third-party reviewers have to be coordinated and conducted, and then selected proposals have to move through contracting. Just the contract negotiation itself after award notice can often take 3+ months, especially if your company has not received DOE funding before. So for these FOAs, many of you may actually be applying to federal funding, or for that matter, any type of funding for the first time. So before we talk about designing a project budget, we need to talk about how to get to the point where you're actually still in business to execute on that budget. I've been in this difficult spot before, both as a venture-backed and a non-venture-backed, i.e. self-funded entrepreneur. And here are some key thinking points. The good news is that there's a lot of money in the world, and you probably haven't thought of all the ways you could fund your business while you wait for this FOA process to play out. Although the most obvious option for startups, maybe venture funding, we need to be honest that many energy companies don't have the growth profile needed to raise money from VCs and maybe too unproven at earlier technology readiness levels. VC funding is also expensive, highly dilutive, and risky, particularly for those companies that have not achieved product market fit or technical validation. On the other end of the spectrum, there's probably no way you can get funding from a bank without a stable revenue and profit stream. And I put many other late-stage investors in that same category as well. So we need to find other sources to solve this chicken and egg dilemma that don't actually take forever to come through. I think to start off, you also need to address the reality that being a founder is significantly higher risk and higher reward than any other form of employment you'll encounter. So for those of you that are founders here and have significant ownership in your company, like I have today and have several times, you need to embrace this risk while finding other ways to mitigate your immediate downside. So this could include doing consulting work for other organizations, could include working on multiple ventures part-time. I think being a founder doesn't have to be a binary decision to take no income for some undetermined period of time. In fact, it should actually give you more freedom and option value than ever before. At a minimum, almost any type of subject matter expertise today can now be bought and sold on Upwork and other consulting platforms. But with the expertise of this group, it's likely your industry network affords you much more direct and high quality opportunities. I think in terms of where the rubber hits the road and where you can actually get some funding for your venture, I think one key area to look at is smaller state grants. So I think for those of you that are fortunate enough to be in states that are actively supporting energy innovation, smaller state grants may in fact be the most straightforward way to fund your work while you're waiting for FOAs and other larger strategic opportunities. So for example, in California, you have the Cal Seed program, which can actually be upwards of $1 million. In New York, NYSERDA has various ponds. These are demonstration projects for research, development, and deployment. And of course, Massachusetts, through the Mass CC, has various topic areas that are open to bid for small businesses. And these states are, in fact, today aggressively seeking out projects which invest in our energy transition. And behind them, there are a host of other emerging players in this space, like Colorado, Connecticut, and others that are also trying to seed more of these efforts. In addition to energy-specific grants, there are also industry-agnostic innovation grants. I've worked several times with the Maryland Industrial Partnership Program. This is a program in Maryland that allows you to essentially hire 1 FTE per year at a Maryland university to help support your work. Lastly, you also hear the term in-kind more than once as we go through this webinar. I think you should really think about what kind of non-cash support you can get from industry partners, universities, and other collaborators. Maybe it's free use of a piece of test equipment. Maybe it's some sample materials. Maybe it's a demonstration site for your project. All these things could have meaningful benefit toward building your credibility for FOA and other funding opportunities. And I think anything you can get while you're applying to this opportunity will be additive to your business case as a company. Now let's circle back to the FOA. You've completed the concept paper and gotten the green light to submit. Where does the budget fit in your company's funding plan? If you look at this FOA, you'll see that typically funding opportunity announcements have guidance regarding a number of awards, the overall size of the FOA, and the average size of the award. Those specifications are listed here again for dual-use PV and thin film. And those of you that may be using this module for other funding opportunity announcements should see similar guidelines in your documents. So keep in mind that no matter how large the FOA proposal, it can at maximum accommodate 80% of your company funding needs for this project. There's a 20% cost share requirement. We'll talk more about that later, but the most simple explanation is that for every dollar you invoice, you have to subtract 20 cents from that invoice as a cash contribution to the project, unless you find other forms of cost share, which we'll cover later. I think also keep in mind that the typical DOE FOA size will allow you to hire no more than a few full-time employees per year. This is meant to be seed or early stage funding to develop a product or service. You need to approach a proposal with a lean management mindset. And you need to start thinking right away about how commercial traction of some form and different grant pursuits can be complementary. But I think the reality is you will not get to a cost-effective scale simply with R&D funding. So someone else, whether it be a financial investor or a strategic partner, still needs to fund R&D work at risk as well. Now, let's go through some of the key categories in the budget justification and talk about some of the critical things which you need to manage in order to execute a successful project that puts your company in a strong operational and strategic position coming out of the proposal process. I think for most of you, the bulk of the expense in these projects will be spent on labor. As we've mentioned, one of the trickiest parts about managing labor for grants is that you may need more capabilities than your headcount budget allows you to hire. In fact, many of you may be proposing a project where none of your team members are even hired yet since you don't have funding. This is where identifying potential hires ahead of time, including part-time employees and interns, can be incredibly valuable because you may not have the capability to hire every position full-time, but filling some positions part-time can provide some critical support to get you to that next phase. Also, we want to make sure we take a really holistic view of your staffing needs in light of the real end game here being commercial success. So although the emphasis here is research, that research has to be supported by a sound commercial value proposition. Certainly, direct sales and marketing expenses are prohibited under various federal funding guidelines. But putting together things like a market advisory team for your project or conducting sound stakeholder discovery, that's a pretty typical part of FOA projects and is likely to create that foundation that you need for future product sales, as well as perhaps external funding interests in your research. So as it pertains to costing labor specifically, one positive aspect of DOE grants is that the framework for setting wages is not quite as rigid as some other agencies, such as the National Science Foundation's SBIR program. So in that program, only averages from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Standards can be used unless your company has other commercial funding sources. That's not a hard requirement here, but nonetheless, U.S. Bureau of Labor Standards is probably a good starting point for whether the rates you set are reasonable, particularly for full-time positions. So it's very easy to go to the link on our slide and also look at, for example, a position like a chemist or physical scientist or a construction engineer. What do they make in a certain area of the country, and what are the mean and median wages? I think another source that's useful is HR websites or surveys from your industry. Certainly solar, which we're talking about primarily here, is a very specialized industry, and wage rates can be very different for position designations in different parts of the value chain. So don't be afraid to pay competitive rates and find good justification for those. But of course, you also have to think about what's my overall budget and how can I cobble together a team that can help me hit the milestones. I think as part of this, it's really important to think about how subject matter experts who work part-time can contribute. It may look really scary on paper to have that obligation of paying somebody, $100 or $125 an hour or more, but you can cap the number of hours that they work in an hourly contract. And certainly from my experience, you'll find that the right subject matter expert may be 10 to 20 times more efficient in supplying guidance and information than an entry-level employee that's researching the same info. Of course, they may also bring important connections and credibility to your work that helps you advance your work faster. The next tab we'll talk about is supplies. Supplies generally apply to any items which are under $5,000 per unit and have a useful life of under 1 year. I would say generally this is the most straightforward part of the budget. These are items you use in your everyday business, and you should have, in most cases, existing vendor pricing in great details. There are a few keys here. Don't get caught up in too much detail and trying to make the forecast perfect. You don't know a year from now what you're going to actually consume in terms of supplies, but reasonable estimate with strong justification is what you need at the moment. Also note that purchasing non-US supplies is discouraged and should only be done when there's no other option which is feasible. Otherwise, you'll find yourself spending additional time documenting and justifying those purchases as part of your project reporting. And lastly, for those of you who may have seen our learning module on supply chain, you realize that even at lab scale, there are a lot of materials that today have long lead times, particularly if they're more specialized things like semiconductor materials, or there could be specialized components for various equipments or systems related to solar. It's important to jump out on those lead time requirements right away. So have a sense, even when you're submitting the proposal budget, how long is this going to take you to get? Do you have a second source for this if your primary source is exhausted? Those are all really important things in terms of like weeding out critical failure mechanisms in your proposal. The next area we're going to cover is equipment. Equipment generally refers to any single item over $5,000. Which would be classified as capital equipment based on GAAP or generally acceptable accounting procedures. So I think those of you that have businesses where you're already capitalizing equipment probably have a good idea of what this is. I think those of you that don't, feel free to follow up with us offline or review the FOA in further detail. But I think short story is if it's over $5,000 and it's a piece of capital equipment, it's going to fall in this category unless you can provide significant justification that it's consumable or has a useful life of under a year. And we'll be very straightforward here in saying that equipment is one of the most difficult categories to manage in a DOE funding proposal. So we here at ADL would generally discourage you from purchasing any equipment at all at this stage. DOE maintains a lien on any equipment used in the project, which may make it difficult for you to do other borrowing and may raise a red flag with investors as well, since those investors or lenders then technically don't have that equipment as collateral to recover any downside. So for those of you that are familiar with lending and have filled out a UCC filing, if you purchase equipment under DOE grant, you'll be asked to fill out a UCC filing with DOE as the beneficiary. This doesn't mean, though, that you won't actually be able to use the grant to fund your equipment. I think there are a couple of alternatives that could be feasible in this case. One is a fee for service arrangement, both for your equipment or others' equipment. This is possible if you have proper justification of the value of the work being conducted. So something that's a good example may be a solar simulator test or testing a piece of building material for thermal conductivity, or fire resistance. All those are things that generally have market values with third-party labs. So if you buy a piece of equipment, or you own a piece of equipment that you're paying for, it's probably easier to put the fee for service on the award budget than it is, putting the actual piece of equipment itself. Another alternative, of course, is leasing. That would actually move the equipment into the contractual or vendor category, which we'll talk about later. But the reality is many companies don't have the credit to get a lease line with an equipment vendor or other lender at this stage. So fee for service is likely easier. I think if you're fortunate enough to have a lease provider that will lease you equipment, that's certainly something that could be looked at. The next tab we'll talk about is one that is seemingly easy, but can actually be one of the most difficult parts to not only budget for, but actually report when you're invoicing your awards. It's travel. You may think travel is the easiest item to budget for because you do this in your everyday life as well. But in reality, even the most experienced and well-resourced companies that are much larger than ADL spend hours of each year documenting and justifying FOA-related travel. And the reason is very simple. It's hard to delineate which travel your organization took that was directly related to a funded government project rather than for other purposes. And government contracts also don't allow for common expenses like alcoholic beverages, seat upgrades, and various other things that would be expensable under a commercial expense policy. So there are two simple guidelines here to follow for travel that will at least help simplify your budget process, but will likely make your billing much easier if you receive the grant as well. I think first is you have to be crystal clear about documenting your project-related travel, state the purpose, and make sure that the expenses you submit are directly tied to that purpose. Some meetings that are easily justifiable as directly related, for example, site visits to vendors, factory trials, other things where it's very easy to attribute work directly to the project. You will absolutely be asked in your invoices if you win this award to submit this detail, and we can assure you that your program manager will review them for good housekeeping. So it's really important to get this right up front. I think that reflects well on you in the review process and makes your life a lot easier later on. Secondly, what guidelines do you use for traveling? GSA, or General Services Administration, the travel rates that are posted online are usually a good starting point for determining what is a reasonable expense. I think you have to take this with a caveat that GSA rates are, in many cases, particularly for airfare and hotels, these are special rates that are negotiated by the government for its own employees traveling on business and may not necessarily be available to contractors. So don't be hesitant about flagging additional needs with your program manager. BTN, Business Traveler Network, which we posted, that's another common source that companies use for benchmarking. And you may have other indices through whether things like AAA or your local Chamber of Commerce that you can use as well. I think at the end of the day at ADL Ventures, we have a detailed expense policy which covers many of these topics, but it's actually rare that we ever refer to it. You may be familiar with Netflix has a legendary corporate culture presentation where their expense policy is actually just a few words. It's act in the company's best interests. I think it's good to use the same guideline in working with the government, and I think if you do that, you're generally going to encounter no issues. And after all, this is ultimately taxpayer money, which comes from you and your friends, families, and neighbors. So you absolutely have the obligation to spend it like it's your own. So you'll notice that we didn't go through all the tabs in order. I think in order of importance, the ones that we've gone through are likely the key ones that most R&D stage firms will need to understand properly for this FOA. I think the last question in the direct cost category we want to answer is contracting. So to sub or not to sub. I think most DOE FOA projects today have more than one team member, as the work is often complex and cross-functional in nature. In fact, some of you may find that you're better suited to being a subrecipient, in which case you don't even need a budget justification if your budget is less than $250,000, and you won't need to submit a formal application because someone else is doing that on your behalf with your help. But if you are the project lead, which I imagine is the primary intent for most people watching this, there's two potential paths here to consider to get additional help on the project. A subrecipient would typically have substantial participation in direction and performance of the project scope. One common example could be a national lab assisting with product testing or techno-economic analysis. Vendors, in contrast, typically provide discrete one-off services. A simple example could be a test lab. A workforce training agency could be another one. Mechanical engineering consultant that helps you develop an equipment or process could be another example. There are probably countless examples, and certainly if you have follow-up questions, you should refer back to ADL, but that gives you some beginning guidelines. So now you think you've conquered all the direct costs in your proposal and you're done. Not so fast. Indirect rates and cost share are actually two of the trickiest items to handle and may ultimately make the success of not only this project, but the viability of your company. For indirect costs, let's start with two basic questions. What is an indirect cost, and why does it even matter for a government funding proposal? I think in its simplest definition, an indirect cost is an organizational cost that cannot be direct assigned to any project. For most of you in the research and development stage, the classification of what is direct and what is indirect is quite simple. You have research activity. You probably don't have a lot of separate projects or funding sources. Your research is going to be your direct costs, and any other organizational overhead like bookkeeping is an indirect cost. Why is it important to properly capture these indirect costs? It's absolutely critical because your indirect cost rate actually allows you to recover a percentage of every direct cost dollar for the purpose of performing these other key functions. So as an example, if you have $1 worth of labor costs and an indirect cost of 50 cents or 50%, every dollar in labor that you charge, you're also able to charge 50 cents in indirect costs. And the idea is that's covering things like facilities, rent, utilities, other expenses that, because they're indirect, need to be assigned across different projects. So this is a way of allocating it, to this particular project. Now, understand up front when you're applying that it's not smart for your company, regardless of whether you get grant funding or not, to just guess at an indirect rate. I think this is fundamental accounting that you need to know to manage your cash flow. And just using a simple accounting program like QuickBooks that can properly code and track project costs, it should be fairly straightforward for you to segregate your direct and indirect costs. This is going to pay huge dividends if you get a grant, because an accounting system that's compliant with various government regulations is actually a requirement to sign the contract and receive money. And an even bigger reason why you need this is that once you get the grant, you actually need to provide full details of your indirect costs every year in what's called an incurred cost proposal. Some of you have contractors may have also heard of this referred to as the ICE model. This model requires you to actually fully document your direct and indirect costs in detail in a fairly complex spreadsheet. Usually the deadline is within 6 months of your fiscal year being complete, which for most of you is going to be June 30th of the following year after you complete a calendar year's worth of work on your grant. Otherwise, any indirect costs that haven't been billed or are overbilled that aren't captured properly in this model actually need to be returned to the government. And we can say certainly as painful as the process as it is to do the ICE model, it's even more painful to have to return money to the government at the end. So that's not something you want to do. And the template you see here is just an example summary. The actual model has more than 20 tabs, and we definitely would require an accounting professional to complete. So for this reason, we actually recommend that small businesses keep things as simple as possible. And when you're looking at the budget justification, choose what's called a single line indirect rate. You're going to see in the spreadsheet model other lines like fringe and SG&A. You should ignore those completely and just list one rate under indirect. Small companies a lot of times will have fringe and SG&A rates that fluctuate from year to year. They won't be representative of future operations, and they may not be the same as typical ratios that larger companies have. Some of you right now, like I said, may not even be able to set up to track indirect costs as a whole, let alone specific sub-item. So single line indirect rate simplifies your already complex work significantly. You can review the federal contracting guidelines and tag all the allowable costs in your accounting system. Some examples are shown here as part of your indirect pool. Any unallowable expenses need to be tagged as unallowable and would be fully paid for out of pocket, regardless of whether you get a grant or not. Last thing I would also emphasize is to be comprehensive and be honest in inputting your indirect rate. Although ADL is not involved directly in the review process, I've personally never seen reviewer feedback as an applicant for a proposal that says the indirect rate is too high. Certainly universities and larger corporations often have indirect rates close to or even over 100%. 50% for those of you that have worked on SBI grants that have safe rates which don't require justification. You'll know that 50% is a good general guideline for small businesses. But the key is to be accurate and honest, or else you'll be leaving cash on the table. And any cash left on the table, as we've talked about, can be critical impairment for a startup, given that it already takes you an extended period of time to bill for and receive cash from these grants. So somewhat related to this, cost share is another area that causes a lot of confusion in proposals that ADL supports, and even on proposals I've worked with on my own after all these years. It can still be something that's not very straightforward to document and track. As I mentioned before, the simplest way to provide cost share is just cash, where you subtract a certain amount from every dollar that you invoice. But there is the opportunity to provide in-kind cost share, and there's a lot of different ways that you can do it. I think just keep in mind that the larger the amount and the harder the product or service is to value, the more time you're going to spend with your contracting officers trying to justify the value of those in-kind contributions. Similar to the process we discussed for charging fee-for-service payments for equipment, you'll usually need some type of fair market value or other appraisal for your asset, or market rate for service being provided. I think, again, those of you that are fortunate to be in states that have cost share support programs, you may know the California Energy Commission has a program to backfill cost share from DOE grants. Mass CEC has the Amplify program, which serves a similar purpose. So if you're lucky enough to have those supplemental funding programs at your disposal, certainly feel free to apply for those. And those can be very meaningful benefit to your project. But that's not the case for all people involved, and you should go into the proposal expecting that 20% cash cost share is going to be what you need to provide, which is one of many reasons why outside funding can be extremely important. Well, so finally, we've been successful in completing the budget justification, and in some cases, a successful budget justification for you guys is going to be the first step toward a major award. That's certainly cause for celebration for any company, whether it's their first funding or not. One thing to remember here as we wrap up is that budgeting is only one part of the proposal submission process. An upcoming module will also cover the entire proposal drafting process and related requirements. But you should certainly feel good about where you're headed once you have completed it. One key thing, again, that we're going to emphasize over and over again is that even after you receive this award, example pre-award documentation is shown here on the screen. It will take not only 3 months to negotiate the contract, but another 2 to 3 months to receive your first payment. That, along with the fact that you've got a fairly early stage technology that's in development in most cases here, that means you need to be thinking about external funding right away. If you haven't thought about it, yesterday, you need to be thinking about it today or tomorrow. So that, again, could be investor funding, it could be loans, it could be strategic partnerships with corporates. These are things you're going to have to get sooner rather than later. And in fact, you should use the grant submission process to generate interest, because this is a good way to request discovery interviews. It's a good way to request support letters. All that feedback is actually going to be a pretty necessary component of your technical volume submission, which we'll talk about in a future module. At least for now, though, you can sit back and relax a bit, understanding you've actually conquered one of the most complicated parts of the submission process and put your company in good position for future success. So on behalf of ADL, it's always a pleasure to support startups that are going through the American Made Challenges. So we want to congratulate you on completing this module. Wish you good luck with the rest of your application, and of course, offer ongoing support in any way that can be provided. So hope you have a wonderful day, and don't hesitate to reach out to us. Thanks again.